The stone was handsome. That was what people remarked upon. Those who visited the Dunmore churchyard in the autumn of any given year and found the Earl of Dunmore already there. The stone was pale Derbyshire limestone, carved with a vine border, and it bore the name Cecily Margaret Ashworth, beloved wife, and below that the dates, the year of her birth and the year of her death, and below that 4 words that the Earl had chosen himself. She was all light. Visitors noted the freshness of the flowers, the swept path to the iron gate, the way the grass at the foot of the stone was kept short even in November. They noted that the Earl stood at the grave in the same attitude every Sunday morning, his hat in his hand, and his head slightly inclined, and that he sometimes appeared to be speaking, though quietly, and that he never appeared to receive an answer, and that this seemed to make no difference to him. The Tun had offered him matches. 6 of them in the first 3 years, when it had seemed that no one quite understood the depth of the thing, and 2 or 3 more in the years after, when they did understand and made the offers anyway, because hope dies harder in an aunt or a family solicitor than it does in a man who has already buried it. He had refused them all with a courtesy that was the same each time, which was itself a kind of statement. The Countess of Dunmore had been dead 10 years, and in every way that the world of 1819 could measure, Edward Ashworth meant to go on behaving as though that were the condition of his existence, and not merely a fact about it. He did not speak to anyone about the grave. He walked to it before breakfast, returned before the household was fully stirring, and said nothing at the table. The servants knew. The estate knew. Mrs. Tully at Ashton Hall next door knew, because Ashton Hall's kitchen had a view of the churchyard wall, and she was a woman who noticed things and kept what she noticed with the same care she kept her linen lists. She had worked at Ashton Hall for 11 years, and she had watched the Earl walk to that stone for 10 of them, and she did not speak of it either. The woman who did the Ashton Hall linen did not watch the churchyard at all. She rose before it was light, which was her practice in every season, and by the time the autumn sky had graded from black to a flat November gray, she had already lit the kitchen range, brought up the coal scuttle from the cellar, laid the fire in the servants' hall, and begun the work that organized every morning at Ashton Hall, which was a large enough house to require a great deal of organizing. Her name, to Ashton Hall, was Clara Marsh. It had been that name for 10 years, which was a long time to be called something that was not your name. She had stopped flinching at it 7 years ago. She had stopped waiting to be corrected for it 6 years ago. She had stopped believing it would ever change somewhere in the middle of the 5th year. And after that, she had arranged her days the way she arranged the linen. Neatly, with everything in its proper place, and with no room left for disorder. She was 31 years old, and slight as a girl of 17, with warm brown skin and gray-green eyes that she kept, by long practice, very still. She wore a plain gray working dress and a white apron. At her collar she wore a small brooch, ivory and old, carved with a woman's profile in the manner of the antique. Her mother had worn it first, and then it had come to her, and then circumstances had come to her, and it was the only thing the circumstances had not taken. Her dark chestnut hair was pinned flat in the mornings, practical, efficient, a few strands loosening by afternoon. She was quiet at work and quiet out of it, and the Ashton household had long since stopped noticing her, which was exactly what she intended. Mrs. Tully noticed her. Mrs. Tully noticed everything. It was Mrs. Tully who had found her 10 years ago, thin and still shaking from the fever, sitting in the laundry yard with no documents and no story that anyone could verify. It was Mrs. Tully who had said, with the pragmatism of a woman who had more work than hands, that she could start in the kitchen, and that was enough for now. It was Mrs. Tully who had grasped, over the years, that Clara was educated, that she read Latin when she thought no one was looking, that she handled herself at table with a composure that did not come from service, and that she would not discuss her past under any circumstance, and that this particular combination of qualities meant something that Mrs. Tully had no desire to investigate aloud. The Ashton children loved Clara. This was the thing that made the days bearable. There were 3 of them, the eldest 9, the youngest 5, and every evening before their supper, Clara sat with them in the schoolroom and read aloud, novels and histories and poetry, and whatever they wanted. And when the youngest had begun to ask some months ago whether she could learn to form her letters, Clara had taught her, patiently and with great thoroughness, as though it were the most important commission she had ever been given. The child's name was Harriet. She called Clara Miss Clara, which was not technically correct on either count, and no one corrected her, because the correction would have required an explanation that no one in the household was prepared to give. It was in the first week of November, in the year 1819, that Lord and Lady Ashton announced they were removing to Bath for the season, and that Lord Dunmore's household, which had a visiting party arriving for the fortnight, would borrow 2 of the Ashton staff to assist. The choice fell, as choices often did, on the staff most likely to manage without complaint. Clara packed a single bag. She did not tell Harriet she was leaving, because Harriet would weep, and weeping was not something Clara had any patience for in children, or in herself. She had not been inside Dunmore in 10 years. She had walked past it. She had seen its drive from the lane, its chimneys in the morning, the light in the library window that stayed burning late. She had not been inside it. The entrance hall was as she remembered it. And then it was not. Because memory is an unreliable document, and the body is a more accurate one. She had walked across that marble floor as the Countess of Dunmore. She had been 21 years old, and newly married, and uncertain, and full of a happiness she had not yet learned to hold quietly. She had put her hand on that banister. She had stood in that doorway and watched the rain come across the park. She stood in the entrance hall now in her gray wool dress and her white apron as a borrowed member of the household staff, and the housekeeper of Dunmore, a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Briggs, directed her toward the servant's stair without looking at her face. She climbed the stair. She did not look at anything she recognized. She put her bag in the room she was assigned, and she went downstairs and she worked. If you are wondering what it is to walk every day in the house that was once yours, to carry coal up the back stairs of a house where you once presided at the table, to fold linens in a room where you once sat reading while a young man who loved you read across from you at the other chair. If you are wondering what the body does in that circumstance, the answer is that the body does the work. The hands are always the thing that saves you. Hands that are occupied do not shake, and work that is real does not allow the mind to run very far in any direction. Clara had known this for 10 years, and she applied it with the same rigor she applied to everything else. It was 2 days into the fortnight when she heard him on the stair. She had not yet seen him. She had arranged her movements with care, knowing the house, knowing which hours brought the family into which rooms, and she had been successful. She was coming up from the kitchen with a tray for the guest corridor on the second day, past 9 in the evening, the visiting party still at dinner downstairs and the corridor empty, when she heard his voice from behind a partly open door. He was speaking to his valet. She could not see him. She heard only a few words. Something about a letter that needed responding to. And then his voice dropped below the range she could follow from the corridor. She stood in the passage, and her hands on the tray went very still. She had heard that voice in her sleep for 10 years, though the dreams had grown infrequent. and the voice in the dreams was always slightly wrong. Too young, or too certain, or calling a name she no longer used. This voice was not wrong. She moved on down the corridor. It was not until the fourth evening that he saw her. She had been sitting with old Thomas, the Dunmore footman who had served the house for 40 years, and who was dying of something slow and quiet in a room at the end of the servants' hall, because he had asked to die in the house, and Mrs. Briggs had accommodated him, as one accommodates a man who has given 40 years to the same work. Clara had brought him soup, and when he had not wanted the soup, he had asked if anyone might read to him, and she had taken the small Bible from the shelf by his narrow bed and read to him from the Psalms, sitting in the chair beside him, her voice low and steady, the candle on the table between them. The Earl of Dunmore stood in the doorway. She did not hear him arrive. She did not know he was there until she came to the end of a verse and raised her eyes from the page and found him watching her from the threshold. He was older than she had last seen him, which she had prepared herself for. The gray at his temples was new, or new to her. The line of his jaw was the same, and the scar at his right brow, and the color of his eyes, which was pewter, which was gray with something of blue in it, and which she had spent 10 years trying to forget the particular shade of. He stood very still in the doorway. He was in his evening dress, a dark navy tailcoat and a high white cravat, and he had the look of a man who had walked away from his own dinner party because something had needed walking away from. She did not speak. He did not speak. Old Thomas, who had drifted into the region between sleeping and waking, that the very ill inhabit, made a small sound and turned his head on the pillow. And Clara looked back at him and read the next verse. And when she looked up again, the doorway was empty. The next morning, Edward Ashworth asked Mrs. Briggs the name of the woman reading to Thomas. Mrs. Briggs said it was Clara Marsh, from Ashton Hall. She said it without particular emphasis, because it had not occurred to her that emphasis was required. He thanked her. He did not explain. He went to the library and stood at the window for a long time and looked at the park, and then he looked at his own reflection in the glass, which he rarely permitted himself to do. And then he went to his desk and worked. Sometime in the working he stopped, because the pen had stopped moving, and he was not certain when. And he was looking at the surface of the desk, and not at anything on it. There was a small scar at the left temple of the woman who read to Thomas. He had not seen enough of her to be certain. He had not seen enough of her to be certain of anything, except that something in the vicinity of his chest had performed a movement he had no name for, and that the small brooch at her collar was a carved ivory cameo, old, with a woman's profile in the antique style. He had the original in a box in his study. He had put it in the box himself, in the year his wife died, because he could not look at it, and could not throw it away. And the box had sat on the same shelf for 10 years, with the same dust on the lid that formed, and was brushed off and formed again. And he had not opened it. He opened it now. The cameo lay on a piece of blue velvet. He had commissioned the copy himself, as a wedding gift, because Cecily's mother had worn this one, and he had wanted her to have something like it that was new, that was hers, that did not carry the weight of the original. The copy had gone into the ground with her. This was the original. He held it in his hand, and he looked at it for a long time. And then he put it back in the box and sat very still at his desk. He had been weeping at a grave for 10 years. He had done it faithfully and with complete sincerity, and had not once suspected that sincerity was not sufficient protection against being wrong. He went to find her. She was at the linen press in the upper corridor, making a careful inventory against Mrs. Briggs's list. He stood at the end of the corridor and watched her for a moment, before she heard him. Her back was to him. Her hair was pinned at the nape of her neck with a dark pin, and a few strands had come loose. And she was writing something in a column with the steady hand of a woman who has written columns for a decade. She was wearing the cameo at her collar. He could not see it from this distance, but he knew it was there. She turned. She looked at him without expression, which was itself a kind of expression. Because the woman he had married would have looked at him with the same composure at 17, when composure was new and costly, and at 21, when it had become habitual, and apparently at 31, when it had become armor. "Miss Marsh," he said. "My lord," she said. He came down the corridor and stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her face. She held his gaze without flinching, which required more effort than she allowed to show, because every nerve in her body was conducting a conversation her face refused to join. "You read to Thomas last night," he said. "He asked for the Psalms," she said. "He asked for them by name?" "The 46th and the 91st. He knew which ones he wanted." A silence. He looked at the linen list in her hands, and then at the brooch at her collar, and then at her face again. The scar at her left temple was pale against her warm brown skin, small and neat, a childhood mark. "Are you comfortable in the room they've given you?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Quite comfortable. Thank you, my lord. If you require anything, tell Mrs. Briggs, or come to me directly." It was an unusual instruction to give a borrowed servant. She noted it. She said, "Yes, my lord." And he nodded and went back down the corridor, and she watched his retreating figure with the still gray-green eyes she had inherited from her father's side, and which her mother had always called her best feature, and she turned back to the linen list, and could not, for a moment, read a single word of it. If you have ever stood in the house you lost and been spoken to by the person you lost it to, in the manner of a person who does not know you, you will understand something of what that particular corridor contained in that particular silence. It is a kind of grief that has no proper category, because it is also, in its way, a kind of meeting. She breathed slowly. She wrote the next number in the column. She did not allow herself to feel it. The following morning he came to the servants' hall before she had gone upstairs, which meant he had come early, or had not been to bed. He sat at the end of the servants' table and asked her questions about the linen inventory, which she answered, and then asked her how long she had been at Ashton Hall, which she also answered, and then asked whether Mrs. Tully was well, which was a question that required no particular evasion. He asked it in the manner of a man who is conducting a conversation in order to sit near someone, which she had known how to identify in another life, and which her body identified now, in this one, without consulting her mind about it. "Eat something," he said, when she had declined the bread a maid offered. She took a piece of bread. He watched her eat it as though this were the most important thing he had supervised in some time. She thought he was going to do something he could not undo, and I cannot let him, because I have no proof of anything. She was wrong about the first part. She did not yet know about Mr. Ambrose Pellet. Mr. Pellet was a solicitor from the Strand, 60 years old and thorough in the manner of a man who had learned that thoroughness was cheaper than error. He had been engaged, very quietly, by the Earl of Dunmore 3 weeks earlier, with a commission to examine the parish register of St. Anne's at Coombe, in Derbyshire, which was the register of the village nearest to the estate of one Mr. Frederick Vane, the Earl's late cousin, where the Countess of Dunmore had died in the autumn of 1809. Mr. Pellet had gone to Derbyshire and examined the register, and found it. He had found the entry that Mrs. Briggs had noticed, but not read carefully, and that the cousin's own housekeeper had known about and had not mentioned, and that the local vicar had filed and forgotten. He had written to the Earl with his findings. The Earl had received the letter that morning. He had read it twice, which was once more than he usually needed. It said, in Mr. Pellet's precise and unremarkable hand, that the entry for the burial of one Cecily Margaret Ashworth, wife of the Earl of Dunmore, dated October 1809, corresponded in the register to a separate handwritten notation. Added, and this was the thing, added in a different ink and a different hand, reading identified as C.A. by testimony of F.V. The notation referenced a Frederick Vane. It did not reference a physician. It did not reference a second witness. It referenced one man who had a direct inheritance interest in the Countess's death, and whose testimony, Mr. Pellet observed dryly, had been the sole basis for the entry. The Earl had put the letter in his coat pocket. He had gone to the servants' hall. He had sat at the end of the table and told a woman named Clara to eat something, because he did not know what else to do with his hands. He wanted to say those words, the ones that could not be unsaid. He did not. He did not say them because he was not yet certain, and because if he was wrong, he would have said an unforgivable thing, and because if he was right, he would need a proper witness, and because the scar at her left temple was exactly where Cecily had told him once, in the first week of their marriage, that she had fallen from a garden wall at the age of 8, and he had kissed the scar, and she had laughed at him, and he had not thought of that fact in 10 years, and it had returned to him in the upper corridor with the force of something that had been waiting. It was that evening that Francis Vane arrived. Vane was 45, lean, with the particular manner of a man who has assembled himself carefully because the underlying material would not assemble on its own. He greeted his cousin warmly. He greeted Lady Hartwell, who had come to oversee the fortnight's arrangements, with the correct degree of affection. He drank his wine and spoke about the shooting, and watched the room with the attention of someone conducting an inventory of their own. He found Clara in the drawing room the next morning, laying the fire. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, and that made the back of her neck cold. "You," he said. "Good morning, sir," she said. "What is your name?" "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "Marsh." He was quiet. He looked at her face, and then at the cameo at her collar, and then at her face again. Something moved in his expression that was not quite recognition, and was not quite denial. "Where are you from?" "Ashton Hall, sir. I am borrowed staff." He said nothing else. He walked to the window and stood there until she had finished with the fire and left, and the coldness at her nape did not dissipate for the rest of the morning. At dinner that evening, his aunt raised the subject of the borrowed Ashton staff in the manner of someone raising a minor household point. "One of them is rather striking," she said, in the way one remarks upon a piece of furniture that does not quite fit the room. "The woman." "Marsh, is she called? The Manor woman from next door. Do you know anything of her, Edward?" "She is an excellent worker," Edward said. "I am sure she is. A pity she has no connections to speak of." She turned to Lady Sophronia, who was seated at her right. Lady Sophronia was 32, very fair, with the composed and pleasant manner of a woman who had been raised to be composed and pleasant, and had become genuinely so through long practice. She was appropriate in every degree. She smiled at the remark with the smile of someone who has not quite heard it and does not need to. Edward did not look at her. "The Manor woman has nothing to recommend her, as far as anyone can determine," Vane said from his end of the table. He said it lightly, as though it were an observation about the weather, and refilled his wine. He did not look at Edward when he said it. Edward looked at Vane. The evening ended in the drawing room with music. Clara was not present. She was in the servants' hall, writing a letter to Mrs. Tully that she did not finish, because she could not settle on what to say, and eventually put the pen down. Through the wall, she could hear, very faintly, the drawing-room piano. She had played that piano herself once. She had played it rather well. She went to bed early. She did not sleep. The following morning, Mrs. Tully arrived at the Dunmore kitchen door with a jar of last month's preserves and a look on her face that Clara read immediately. Mrs. Tully was a plain-spoken woman who showed her emotions as clearly as a window shows light, and the light coming through this particular window was not warm. She sent the other staff out of the kitchen. She sat down. "Lady Hartwell sent a message this morning to Mr. Hawkins," she said, naming the Dunmore secretary. "I heard it from the Dunmore under-footman. She has made an announcement. She told the party at breakfast that Lord Dunmore's engagement to Lady Sophronia Keel is settled." Clara was quiet. "He has not proposed," Mrs. Tully said. "Hawkins was not told. The announcement was her own." She paused. She also said to Mrs. Briggs that she would be glad when the borrowed Ashton staff returned home, as the Manor woman from next door was making herself rather too visible. There it was. 3 voicings, 3 different rooms, and now it had reached her. She looked at her hands. The cameo was at her collar, as always. She thought about what it cost to stay. She thought about what it cost to stay, when staying meant watching an engagement she could not contest, in a house she could not claim, wearing a name she had borrowed and a life she had assembled from leftover pieces. She thought the same words she had been thinking for 10 years. No proof. No documents. I have only the cameo that he gave me, which matches the one in his study, and a scar on my temple, and a face that has changed in 10 years. These are not documents. These are not sufficient. A woman cannot walk into a drawing room and say, "I am your wife," on the basis of a brooch and a scar, and I believe that you knew me once. She cannot. She has nothing. She decided, quietly and without theater, to leave before dawn. She packed her bag that night after the household was asleep. She did it carefully, folding her gray dress, rolling her apron, placing her few books at the bottom. She took the cameo from her collar and held it in her palm for a moment. It was warm from the day's wear. She thought of her mother, and then she thought of the particular quality of the morning light through a window she had once stood at. And then she stopped thinking, and put the cameo back at her collar, and buckled the bag. She was in the servants' corridor at midnight with the bag over her arm when he appeared at the far end of it. He was carrying a candle. He was still dressed, which meant he had not been to bed. Because he had been sitting with something that would not let him sleep. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the bag. He looked at her face. "You are leaving," he said. "Yes," she said. A silence, long enough to be heard. The candle in his hand was steady. His face was not. "I would ask you not to," he said. She looked at him. She thought of all the things that were impossible to say in a servant's corridor at midnight, with a bag in one's hand, and no documents and no name that anyone would accept. "I cannot stay," she said. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Until morning. That is all I am asking." She should have said no. She knew the shape of what would follow if she said yes, and the shape of it frightened her more than the alternative. Because the alternative was simply the continuation of a life she had already been managing. And what he was asking for was something she had no practice managing at all. She put the bag down. He did not exhale in the way a man exhales when he has been holding his breath. though he had been holding his breath. He simply looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Good night, Miss Marsh." He turned and walked back down the corridor. And she stood there in the darkness with her bag at her feet and the candle he had left on the hall table for her. And she stood there thinking, well. Morning came, as mornings will, indifferent to the arrangements made in corridors at midnight. At 8 o'clock, he sent word to the drawing room requesting the household to assemble. He sent the same word to the servants' hall. He sent a brief note to Mr. Ambrose Pellet, who had arrived in the village the previous evening at the Earl's invitation and was currently at breakfast in the Green Hart, which was Dunmore's coaching inn, and who received the note, folded his napkin, and came. The drawing room filled as drawing rooms do when a man of rank requests an assembly, with the particular attention that is always paid to people who can alter the furniture of your life. His aunt came in first, brisk and prepared. Lady Sophronia came in with the calm of a woman who had been told very little and intended to remain calm regardless. Francis Vane came in last, with the watchfulness he had brought to the dinner table the previous evening magnified, his eyes moving to every corner of the room. Clara came in with the household staff and stood at the back, near the window. She had not repacked the bag. She had the cameo at her collar and her hands quiet at her sides, and she was very still. Edward stood at the mantelpiece. Mr. Pellet stood to one side, holding a document folder, and the expression of a man who is being paid to be present and intends to earn every shilling of it. "I have asked you here," Edward said, "because a matter of some consequence requires clarification before this party concludes." He spoke evenly, without volume, in the manner of a man for whom the room has been listening for long enough that he need not raise his voice. "Mr. Pellet has in his possession a document obtained from the parish register of St. Anne's at Coombe in Derbyshire, examined 3 weeks ago at my commission. Mr. Pellet." Mr. Pellet opened the folder. He summarized the register entry with the brevity of a man reading from evidence rather than argument. He summarized the notation, the single witness, the name of the witness, and the absence of any physician's confirmation. He said these things in a voice that did not inflect. He said, at the end, that the entry as recorded was not legally sufficient to constitute identification of a named person, and that the estate matters settled upon the basis of that entry were, in consequence, subject to review. Vane had gone the color of old wax. His aunt's fan, which she had been turning in her hands, was very still. Edward reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small object. He held it in his open hand. It was a cameo, ivory, old, a woman's profile in the antique style. He crossed the room. He crossed it in the manner of a man crossing a distance he has been crossing in his imagination for 3 weeks, which is to say directly and without hesitation, and the assembled party stepped back, not because anyone asked them to, but because a room can perceive when a crossing has a destination and leaves the path clear accordingly. He stopped in front of Clara. She did not step back. She looked at the cameo in his hand, and then at his face, and something moved in her gray-green eyes that was not quite expression, and was not quite its absence, and her hand came up and touched the copy at her collar. He said, "This woman is my wife. She has always been my wife." 11 words, level, final. Spoken with the quiet authority of a man who knows that some things require only saying once. His aunt put her hand on the back of the chair nearest to her. Lady Sophronia looked at the floor for a moment, and then at Edward. And then she turned her head toward the window with the composure of a woman who has absorbed a blow and intends to stand. It was, under the circumstances, rather graceful. Vane said nothing. His silence was the silence of a man who has already begun calculating. Clara looked at Edward. She looked at the cameo he held, and at the one she wore, and at his face, which was the face she had been carrying in the poorest chamber of her memory for 10 years, permitting herself to look at it only when the night was long enough and the work had been hard enough that her discipline dropped for a moment. "I have no documents," she said. Her voice was steady. Her voice had always been steady. "I have no proof of any kind." "Mr. Pellet has proof," he said. "I have the cameo. I have the scar at your temple. I have the knowledge that you read the 46th Psalm to a dying man because you knew, without being told, that it was what he needed, and I have 10 years of speaking to a grave that I should have been speaking to you." He paused. "I have enough, if you will allow it." She looked at him for a long time. The room waited. Rooms know how to wait when they are waiting for the right thing. She said, "Yes, Edward." It was the first time she had used his name in 10 years. He covered her hand with his, around the cameo, and the room exhaled. "Let it be said here, if you have stayed this long, that what followed was not a triumph, and was not intended to be one. It was a correction." She left the drawing-room without speaking, and sat in the morning-room for an hour. And when she came out again, her manner had shifted in the way that the manner of sensible people shifts when they are confronted with an error they had no way to anticipate, toward a kind of careful reckoning, and away from the confident architecture that had produced it. She did not apologize in words. She apologized in behavior, which is the more lasting kind. Lady Sophronia returned to London that afternoon with the dignity of a woman who has been offered a wrong and declined to make it worse. She was kinder in the following seasons than she might otherwise have been. Vane was dealt with by Mr. Pellet and a second solicitor over a period of weeks, quietly, with the thoroughness that Mr. Pellet had always applied to everything, and the matter was settled in the manner that such matters are settled when one party has the documents and the other party has only a notation in a different ink. The wedding was a small thing. It was done in the Dunmore morning room before a fire in December, with the household as witnesses, and Mr. Pellet and Mrs. Tully and the Ashton children, who had been brought over because Harriet had asked where Miss Clara had gone, and the answer had proven too complicated to avoid. Harriet stood between Mrs. Tully and the window and watched the ceremony with an expression of enormous concentration, as though she were committing every detail to a ledger of her own. That evening, after the household had gone to bed, Cecily sat by the drawing-room fire with the ivory cameo at her collar. Edward sat beside her, not across the room, not at the head of any table, not across any carefully maintained distance at all, but beside her, their arms touching, his shoulder warm against hers. On the mantelpiece, the original cameo rested on the piece of blue velvet he had taken from the box. She reached up and touched the copy at her collar. His hand came down and covered hers. The fire was doing what fires do in December, which is to say, burning steadily and without drama and with great warmth. And the snow that had begun outside the window was doing what December snow does, which is to fall silently and change the quality of the dark without changing anything of substance. She had not wept in 10 years. She had decided against it with the same quiet practicality with which she had decided everything, because weeping required a belief that things might be otherwise, and she had not been able to afford that belief. She had carried the cameo, and she had read the Psalms, and she had taught a child her letters, and she had done the work every day without weeping. She wept now. Not loudly. Quietly, in the manner of someone releasing a very heavy thing they have been carrying for a very long time. He said nothing. He kept his hand over hers. He let her. Outside, the snow fell on Dunmore churchyard, on the handsome Derbyshire limestone, on the vine border, on the 4 carved words that he had chosen and that she had never read, because she had not been able to bring herself to walk to that corner of the churchyard, not in 10 years, not once. The grave was there. It had always been there. It held someone, a young woman the fever had taken, whose name no one had ever properly known, and who had been given, in the end, a stone that said she was all light, and flowers that were always fresh, and a man who had spoken to her every Sunday morning because he had been told she was there. The stone remained. The grave remained. The grief had been real. None of that was in question. What was in question was only whether a woman, in a gray wool dress, with a brooch at her collar and a scar at her temple and no documents and no name that anyone would accept, had been seen. She had been seen. The fire burned down slowly. His hand was still over hers. Harriet had left her spelling primer on the table, and the primer sat on the table in the firelight with its pages open to a lesson neither of them was going to finish tonight, and it would be there in the morning. And so would they. And outside the snow was very quiet, and the grave was very still, and the living had come inside at last.